Today I'm going to share my top 5 novels I read in 2023, and for each book I'm going to share the #1 writing lesson I learned from it. First of all, we have Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is a cozy fantasy story about an orc named Viv, who decides to put aside her life of adventuring to open up a coffee shop in a medieval fantasy city that has never heard of coffee before. This book was just so much fun. It was a really enjoyable kind of palate cleanser read. The tagline of the story, which I really love, is the idea of high fantasy, low stakes, and good company. So it's not a story about these massive world-ending consequences or these huge adventures. It's just this very quiet story about a young woman who's trying to find something different in her life, who's trying to create this community of people around the coffee shop that she's opening in this city. I really think that this is the ideal book to pick up if you've maybe been struggling through some heftier fantasy tomes and you're looking for something that is a bit lighter, a bit more of a palate cleanser between different stories. For me, I think it was such a fantastic comfort read, and I can definitely see myself returning to this book many times in the future when I want a break from some of the bigger or heftier fantasy stories that I tend to read. Something that I also really enjoyed about this novel was I quite related to Viv's struggles of becoming a small business owner. For the last couple of months, I've been a full-time writer and a full-time YouTuber thanks to the growth of this channel, and thanks to you for watching these videos and everything. And it's been a really enjoyable process, but there's been a lot of stresses and a lot of difficulties that have come along with it. Now, I've signed up for this, so I very much enjoy the pathway I'm on. But this book was really great because it kind of paints a very realistic picture of Viv's own struggles of trying to set up this coffee shop, of trying to market herself, of trying to get her business out there, of trying to satisfy her customers. And one of the most profound things that I enjoyed about this book is how not only does it show you the struggles that she goes through, but it also shows you the particular joys of creating a small business that gives such benefit, such a sense of community to people. And I personally think one of the greatest benefits of stories is that they kind of give us a map of how to behave or think about the experiences in our life. And I think that Legends and Lattes, weirdly enough, was a story that kind of gave me a really useful map to think about how to run this YouTube channel and how to run the creative business that I'm building around it. I think that just reminding you of how lucky you are to run a small business that, in Viv's case, creates amazing coffee for people to experience. In my case, it's creating these videos that hopefully help you with your writing and everything. I think this book just unlocked a lot of gratitude and a lot of joy and appreciation within me. So I imagine that this is also, in addition to being a comfort read, something I'll go back to as almost like a gratitude read when I want to remind myself of the kind of joys that come along with the stresses of what I'm doing right now. And before I get onto the writing lesson for this, I just want to say a massive thank you to the huge growth that this YouTube channel has seen over the past year. At the start of last year, I think we had 4,000 subscribers on here. Now we're almost at 50,000, which is utterly ludicrous. And like I said before, this is my full-time job, and I feel so grateful to be in this position right now. And I really, really appreciate whenever someone sends me a message saying that they have written a book thanks to the stuff I'm teaching and sharing on this channel. So it really means a lot to me, and I think this book just put me in a very grateful mood. So in terms of the writing lesson that Legends and Lattes taught me, it would be the importance of creating a world that is fun for the reader to exist in. Now, I don't have anything against gritty, dark fantasy worlds. I've certainly written plenty of those myself in my own fantasy novels, and I really enjoy reading them too. But there's just something so nice about this kind of cozy, quaint fantasy world that is just fun to inhabit, and it doesn't feel threatening. It just feels like a warm blanket. And that's exactly what Baldree creates in Legends and Lattes. He just creates this cozy sense of community around Viv's coffee shop there, and the ambience of brewing coffee, the smells, the immersion, the sensory details of the story, the snow falling outside. It just creates such an enjoyable place to inhabit. And I actually think that this is a reason why the Harry Potter books were so successful, because one of the big points of attraction for those books, for me at least, is that sense of sitting in the Gryffindor common room while a cozy fire is crackling in the hearth, and you're just messing around and chatting with your best friends while you're learning magic in this cool environment. And I think that this story tapped into that same sense of these small found families, these small communities, and these warm, cozy spaces. And I've actually had the pleasure to chat to Travis as well. I interviewed him about a year ago on this YouTube channel, so I'll link to that in the description down below if you want to check out my discussion with him. At the time, I actually hadn't read this book, so I awkwardly got the name of it wrong when I was introducing him in the episode, but it was still a great chat and it inspired me to read this story, and I'm really glad that I did. So my fourth favorite book that I read in 2023 was Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. This was one of Sanderson's 4 secret projects that he launched on Kickstarter. And the story follows two different characters in very different worlds. Yumi comes from a land of gardens, spirits, and meditation. She's a Yoko Hijo, serving as a priestess who stacks stones in such a way that it attracts spirits who marvel at the artistry she's created, and those spirits then allow themselves to be bound to serve particular purposes. For example, the spirits might allow someone to have their house float off the ground, or it might allow them to help with some other aspect of their domestic life. Meanwhile, Painter lives in this futuristic city that is powered by these kind of glowing neon lines called the Hyon. And these glowing lines are the only thing that keeps the city safe from the darkness that envelops it and spreads out in all directions. As a nightmare painter, he protects the city from the monsters that come out of the shadows by drawing a less threatening version of these creatures, which then transforms them into that image. But when Yumi and the nightmare painter suddenly find their lives intertwined in a strange way, they have to begin to work with each other and understand each other's cultures if they are to save both of their worlds from destruction. So what did I think about this book? Well, I think it just has such a brilliant magic system. And of course, that is, by this point, a totally standard thing to say about a Brandon Sanderson novel. But what I appreciated so much about the magic system in this book was just how kind of small scaled and place specific it was. It wasn't this really big, grand magic system that you could kind of just plop into any location. It was such a setting specific idea about painting these nightmares that come out of this shadow, or summoning spirits by stacking rocks. There's something just so kind of quaint and small scaled about it that really set it apart. I actually talked more about the concept of place-specific magic systems in this video, where I shared 18 ways to write unique magic systems. So I'll link to that in the description as well. Now, the writing lesson that Yumi and the Nightmare Painter taught me was the importance and the excitement of scaling. So the story starts incredibly small scaled, like I mentioned. The characters are kind of just operating in one contained environment. It's very tiny with the magic system, but over the course of the story, things scale up and there is a fantastic twist later on, which kind of accelerates the proportions of the story in a really meaningful and interesting way. And when you can kind of scale up your story in this way, taking readers from this little village, these little circumstances up to these big stakes, when you do it right, it creates such a sense of growth and progression within the narrative. And it really makes you feel like you've just gone on this incredible journey with the characters. Book number 3 is Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. I don't actually have a copy of this book on hand because I gave it to my cousin to read. And the story is set in 1940s New York about a young writer who falls under the spell of Holly Golightly, a dazzling, charismatic young woman who sweeps up equal parts romance and dismay as she whirls through the city's social scene. Now, the reason why I love this book so much is, first of all, it just felt incredibly modern, even though it was written in, I think, the late 1950s. There was just such a modern pacing to it. The story absolutely rips through you. It's only 100 pages long, so it's really quick to read, and it's so fast-paced, and the characters are just brilliant. And for me, it really hit that Great Gatsby vibe. So The Great Gatsby, one of my favorite novels of all time. I've read it probably 6 or 7 occasions, and this story kind of follows the same idea about the allure of meeting this kind of magical, very charismatic figure who then turns out to maybe have some darkness under the surface. And just the kind of allure and the charm of Holly, the main character from this novel, and how she kind of sweeps up our main writer character in this grand sort of adventure within this rather mundane setting was just so intoxicating and entrancing to read. This book also has one of the best last pages I have ever read. It's so incredible. It kind of pulls off this crazy magic trick where there are all these different threads and elements of complication and nuanced feelings that you develop towards Holly Golightly throughout the book. And the last page manages to wrap them all up and tie them all together in an incredibly elegant and poignant and profound way. I teared up a little bit at the ending. I think the last couple of paragraphs are some of the best ending lines I've ever read to a story. Somehow managing to wrap up all the emotions and make you realize what you've experienced in just such a staggeringly poignant and meaningful, long-lasting way. It's genuinely worth reading this book just for the last couple of lines. The whole book is amazing, but the ending itself is incredible, particularly when you consider that Truman Capote only had 100 pages to get you there. This wasn't some massive epic that has a big ending because of you just spending so much time with the story. It's an ending that the language and the kind of choices that are made in that last scene generate a tremendous amount of emotion within themselves. So what writing lesson did I learn from Breakfast at Tiffany's? The main thing I learned is how you can make a objectively unlikable, manipulative, and sometimes callous character like Holly, the main character of this book, you can take a character like that who is objectively filled with many bad traits. But if you also show a side of them that is likable and charming and witty and enjoyable to be around, then readers will love that character. And I think that this reflects a very key lesson about characters, which a lot of people don't get. And it's the sense that characters and our relationships to them are never objective. They are always subjective. And by having a character show wit and humor and charm, and by leading us into these crazy situations and doing things that 95% of other characters would never think to do, that's how you create a real sense of attraction and allure with the characters in your novel. Holly fills these pages and brings this story to life because she sort of pursues her pathway through life with this certain freeness of spirit that is really alluring and really interesting to follow along. Capote even said that Holly Golightly was his favorite character that he ever wrote, and I think that this speaks to how when you build a sense of complexity into a character, you have contradictions, you have a mix of positive traits and negative traits, and you're willing to show a character being bad at sometimes. That's how you create an incredible sense of realism, of three-dimensionalness, and depth to a character that keeps them lingering in your mind long after the pages close. Now, before I get to number 2 on this list, I just wanted to quickly mention that if you want to stay up to date with the books I'm reading in the future, you might want to check out my Instagram account. So this is a place where I often post stories about the books I'm reading, but it's also a place where I just share what I'm getting up to outside of my writing as well. So you can check that out by going on Instagram and searching for me. I'm at Herne there, and I'll also link to it in the description as well. Now, my second favorite book from 2023 was Jade City by Fonda Lee. Jade City is set in this Asian-inspired city called Janloon, and it's a place where Jade grants superhuman abilities. We follow the Call family, a powerful kind of mafia gang set within the city, as they struggle against a rival clan that's attempting to destroy them. And through the process, they're really forced to confront their loyalties, their ambitions, and the cost of power. This story was just such a brilliant fusion of kind of The Godfather with Hong Kong action movies infused with this amazing magic system where you have Jade as something that grants you incredible superhuman abilities like the capacity to hear what's going on the street outside your noodle place where you're eating, the capacity to have great strength, the capacity to make bullets deflect as they shoot towards you. But Jade also comes at a great cost because Jade has a tendency to drive you insane. Now, this is really difficult because the amount of Jade that you have in this society is directly related to your status. So you might want to wear a lot of Jade to get high status, but that might lead to you developing Jade itches and eventually going insane. And I think what I love most about this story is how everything just intertwines so seamlessly. The city of Janloon felt incredibly realistic right from page 1. A few years ago, I actually lived in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam for 3 months working as an architect over there. And so many of the descriptive passages within this story just brought me right back to kind of the sweaty humidity and the street atmosphere and the food and the general vibe of that city. And it's just such a perfect backdrop for this very Shakespearean family drama about the Calls struggling to maintain their way of life as this much more powerful clan attempts to destroy them. The characters just feel so richly complex and realistic, and this is only the first book in a trilogy, so I'm very excited to see how books 2 and 3 continue from here. In terms of the main writing lesson I learned from Jade City, it would be the importance of a character web. So when I'm developing the characters in my own stories, I like to be thinking about what are the relationships that exist between all these different characters. Sometimes new fantasy writers, they focus so much on their protagonist and their antagonist, but they neglect to think about how the other points of your character web can influence those characters. How are these other characters presenting forces of opposition? How are they forcing your main character to grow? In what ways do they explore the theme of your story or the ideas of your story in subtly different ways from your main character? And everyone in Jade City is kind of exploring these questions around power, what it means to be a leader, what it means to be in a position of magical strength. And they all do it in very different ways. And of course, because they're all taking different approaches and because they view the world in these radically different ways, it leads to a tremendous amount of conflict and character growth and progression between them. And now we get to my number 1 book of 2023, which I am so excited to share with you. I absolutely love this. And that book was The Disenchanted by Bud Schulberg. So considered by a lot of people, and probably myself included, to be Bud Schulberg's masterpiece, this novel came out in the 1950s, and it tells the story of Manly Halliday, an incredibly successful and prolific writer within the 1920s, kind of a golden figure within a golden jazz age, who by the late 1930s is now broke, his marriage has crumbled to pieces, he's an alcoholic, and he's working for the Hollywood establishment, writing scripts on B-grade, crappy movies to make a buck and pay off his debts. When he's put on the script writing team for Love on Ice, which is this really lame, hackneyed musical that he's writing for a studio, he is paired up with a young writer called Shep. And Shep idolizes Manly Halliday. He's always looked up to him. He was someone who created such a deep craving within Shep to kind of experience the 1920s, even though he never lived in that era himself. And now Shep is getting this chance to work with his hero. But he soon realizes that maybe sometimes you shouldn't meet your heroes, because the picture and the perception he has of Manly Halliday in his head struggles to live up to the reality of this character. So what did I think about this book? Well, I genuinely don't think I've ever read a book that was as tailored to my specific interests as The Disenchanted was. So like I said, this is actually written by Bud Schulberg, and it's very heavily based on Bud Schulberg's own experience of working with F. Scott Fitzgerald, the author of The Great Gatsby, in Hollywood at around a similar time. And Bud Schulberg is someone who tremendously looked up to F. Scott Fitzgerald and just idolized him as a writer and as a representation of the jazz age of the 1920s. And it's really funny because I kind of feel like I almost have that same relationship to F. Scott Fitzgerald as well. Obviously, never met him, never going to, because he's been dead for a long time. But I think I kind of have this idolization of the 1920s, and it's a period that is so fascinating to me because of the power and the prose and the romance that F. Scott Fitzgerald creates in The Great Gatsby. So seeing another writer kind of go through that experience in the 1930s, like Bud Schulberg did with this book, was so riveting and so fascinating to me. I'm also just so fascinated by the fledgling romance and allure and the somewhat mirage-like dreams of early 1920s and 1930s Hollywood. I really, really adored Babylon, which is a Damien Chazelle movie set in this era about the struggles of actors in that time. And more generally, I just love stories about art. You know, this is what I hope to dedicate my life towards. I've been writing for pretty much forever, and just stories about the kind of allure and the passion and the romance of art, but also the dark sides of it, how it can be tragic sometimes, how it can corrupt what you're seeking from life and lead you down these dangerous pathways. It's all so fascinating to me, and I think that Bud Schulberg just explores this with such tenderness and well-roundedness and complexity in this novel. Manly Halliday's life has such a allure. You see the heights that he soars to in the 1920s as this kind of celebrated writer that becomes the voice of the generation coming out of World War I, putting voice to the feelings and the difficulties that people experienced in that horrible event. But then you also see the kind of downside of him, and you see the tragedy and the descent in the back end of his life. But it's not as simple as just showing a hero be reduced to nothing. There are moments of beauty where you see Halliday glimmer and you see him reclaim parts of his former glory. Some of the best parts of this novel are the flashback sequences where we go back to the 1920s, where Halliday meets his wife while he's over in Paris after the war is finished. And the description and the prose in those sections was like something that F. Scott Fitzgerald had written himself. It was just incredibly magical, and the capacity he had to just make you bond with characters so quickly, utterly unmatched as far as I'm concerned. The prose, just amazing. And so the story is made all the more poignant by the fact that we see these little glimmers of hope, and we see these chances for Halliday to repent. And the ending of the story is really interesting because it's kind of leaving it up to your interpretation or not as to whether Halliday did have this little redemption at the very end. And so I think the main writing lesson I learned from The Disenchanted was the idea of the opposite rule. That is to make a tragedy feel truly tragic and to have a deep emotional impact on your readers. You don't do that through describing the tragedy. The way you actually make that tragedy feel horrible is by showing us the heights that your character soared to before, or showing us what your character is capable of, but now showing us where they actually are in reality. In other words, the opposite rule shows us that to make tragedy hit hard, show us how good the good old days were. And you can do this with anything in your story. If you want to make a character's triumph feel meaningful, then show us how much they are suffering before they achieve that triumph. So let me know your favorite reads of 2023 down in the comments below. And if you're looking for some good books to read this year, you might enjoy some of my own novels, Across the Broken Stars, Fires of the Dead, The Thunder Heist, or Kingdom of Dragons. I'll be linking to all of those in the description down below.